Good afternoon, I'm Julia Kempton, and today's news story focuses on how anti-racism movements in the United States have, and haven't, changed aid work in the Global South. Last summer, among widespread Black Lives Matter protests across the United States, there was a renewed focus, especially among mostly white Americans working in the development sector, on the need to decolonize aid and address racism in foreign policy. Despite some high-profile terminology changes and the appointment of a Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at the U.S. State Department, and a lot of press releases at different aid organizations, it's unclear if much has actually changed. One of the goals of the Economic Development Group is to focus on international development in emerging economies, and we've discussed in debates at length how that's intertwined with aid and humanitarian assistance, and how we consider the ways in which prejudice and colonialism factor into that as well. Domestic racism has long undermined U.S. foreign policy. It's pretty ridiculous for the U.S. to claim the moral authority on human rights when it's built on the violence of white supremacy and systemic racism, but can also affect international development in more subtle ways. The white savior narrative of humanitarian aid has its roots in often violent and forceful Christian missionary traditions dating back centuries, but it gained prominence in the 1980s when movements like We Are the World began spreading catchy jingles and creating short television advertisements featuring images of malnourished children in sub-Saharan Africa. First mainly in Ethiopia, then in Sudan and Somalia in the 90s, to solicit donations to famine relief efforts. Many in these efforts helped a lot of people, such as with the airlift in Sudan, but they tended to focus on Western aid groups, meaning a lot of money was siphoned off before it ever reached the intended communities, and they created what some people have called poverty porn, reinforcing stereotypes about endemic poverty in Africa that reduce a continent of 1.3 billion people in 54 countries into a false and one-dimensional narrative about rural poverty. One of the main dangers with a white savior or colonial approach to aid, which focuses on the satisfaction of the aid giver rather than the actual recipients and those in need, is that it tends to be dangerously short-term. When aid groups are trying to solicit donors, they want to show the biggest possible impact, so they select metrics that show a short-term benefit. The New York Times, writing about aid that was sent to Sudan in the 90s, explained that, quote, plane loads of free American corn can help famine victims in the short term, but they can also put local farmers out of business, making the food supply in the long term more precarious. Relief efforts in Sudan may have saved countless lives, but they also emboldened combatants who controlled access to food, prolonging a brutal war. Similarly, the international efforts in Somalia to stand in for the government have sometimes harmed attempts by Somalis to create governing structures of their own, fostering long-term dependency. One group working to overcome this is NEAR, or the Network for Empowered Aid Response, a coalition of local and national civil society organizations from the Global South, which is based in Nairobi. It points out that the top-down, foreigner-dominated system of handing out assistance is dangerously reminiscent of colonial hierarchies, and is unable to engage with the people on the ground, or grassroots activists. NEAR has called for an immediate cessation of, quote, the marketing of people in the Global South as passive beneficiaries of aid who need white saviors, and released a statement saying that international fundraising should be based on amplifying the dynamic work that communities themselves are engaged in. In 2016, a group of major aid organizations, pushed by the work of NEAR and activists like Degan Ali, pledged that by 2020 they would send 25% of their aid funding as directly as possible to local and national organizations in the Global South, rather than using the missionary-style structures headed by mostly white foreigners and based overseas. But between 2016 and 2020, direct funding to national and local groups had actually declined from 3.5% of aid funding to 2.1%, reinforcing the top-down approach. Paperwork hurdles for small groups have repeatedly foiled plans by USAID to transition about 30% of its funding to direct aid, but levels remain at around 10% instead. Some good work has been done to move aid offices into the countries where they work. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation increasingly runs operation from its regional headquarters in Abuja and Addis Ababa, but the field of international development as a whole has a lot of work to do to shift a lot more of its funding and decision-making processes to regional stakeholders in Africa and in the Global South more generally, especially if they want to make progress on the UNDP's Sustainable Development Goals, number 1, no poverty, and number 10, reduced inequalities. That's been the news for this week, so now on to the meeting.